The whole kingdom heard the silence before they heard the words. Roselyn stood in her wedding white, flowers still woven into her hair, when Prince Calin turned from her, in front of every lord, every soldier, every friend she had ever known, and took another woman's hand instead. "I choose Illyra," he said. No apology, no warning. Just 3 words that ended a life she had spent years building. Roselyn did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stood there, in a silence so complete she could hear her own heart breaking, wondering how a love that once felt eternal could be erased in a single sentence. She had no idea that this humiliation, this public, merciless ending, was about to become the beginning of everything she was always meant to be. If you want to know how a broken woman becomes unforgettable, subscribe to Elf Stories, tap like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Let's begin. Roselyn was not born to be discarded. She was born beneath the silver canopy of the Ashwood Court, daughter of a healer line so old that even the eldest elves spoke of her family with quiet reverence. From the time she could walk, she had been told what she was for: heal, serve, marry well, hold the kingdom together with hands too gentle to ever ask for anything of her own. She had never resented it, not truly, because for 3 years, being chosen by Prince Calin had felt like being seen, really seen. For the first time in her long, careful life, he had called her his match in wit, his equal in heart. He had promised her forever in the kind of voice that made forever sound like a place you could actually live. She believed him. That was her first mistake, though she would spend a long time refusing to call it that. What Roselyn feared most, long before the wedding day arrived, was not losing Calin. It was becoming what her mother had become. A woman so devoted to duty that she disappeared inside it, remembered only for what she gave, and never for who she was. Roselyn's mother had died young, worn thin by decades of healing others, while no one ever thought to ask who healed her. Roselyn used to sit at her mother's bedside in the final weeks, holding a hand that had spent a lifetime holding everyone else's pain, and promise herself silently that she would never let herself become invisible in the same way. She had built her entire identity around being indispensable, needed, necessary. If she was necessary, she reasoned, she could never be left behind. She was wrong about that too. In the weeks before the wedding, small things had unsettled her. Calin's eyes lingering too long on Illyra during council meetings, the two of them falling into laughter that stopped the moment Roselyn entered a room. Illyra's name spoken by the elders in hushed, careful tones, the way people speak about something they are trying very hard not to reveal. Once, Roselyn had walked past the eldest counselor's chamber and heard her own name spoken alongside the word risk. She had stood frozen outside the door, hand raised to knock, and then lowered it, telling herself it was nothing. She told herself a great many things in those final weeks, because believing them was easier than facing what her instincts already knew. She remembered, too, a smaller cruelty that she had buried so deep she rarely let herself think of it. The day, only a month before the wedding, when she had offered to help prepare the barrier blessing alongside the court's senior mages, only to be gently, firmly turned away. "Your gift is for healing bodies, dear one," the eldest mage had told her, in a tone that was kind on the surface and hollow underneath. "Leave the old magic to those built for it." She had not understood then how much that sentence was already deciding her fate without her. There had been a night, only weeks before the wedding, when Roselyn woke to find her chambers empty of the small silver mirror her mother had left her, the only object she owned that still smelled faintly of home. She found it later in a servant's hands, being carried toward Illyra's rooms, on the prince's orders, she was told, for the new arrangements. No one explained what arrangements. No one thought an explanation was owed to her. She had stood in the corridor holding her own confusion, like something breakable, and told herself again that it was nothing. She had become very good by then at telling herself it was nothing. She had built her worth on being chosen. She did not yet understand that worth built entirely on someone else's choice is not worth at all. It is a loan, and loans can always be called due. When Kaylin said Elira's name at the altar, something inside Roselyn did not just break, it emptied. She felt herself become weightless in the worst possible way, as though the version of her that mattered had simply been lifted out and carried off, leaving behind a shape that still looked like a woman, but no longer felt like one. The court did not comfort her. Elven nobility rarely does. They watched with the same detached fascination they might give a falling star. Beautiful, brief, none of their concern. A few of the younger nobles even smiled behind gloved hands, as though her ruin were the finest entertainment the season had offered. Roselyn walked out of that hall alone, her white gown dragging through petals meant for a celebration that would never happen, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that no one was coming after her. She remembered, walking away from that hall, the years of small sacrifices she had made without ever being asked. Cancelled visits to her mother's grave because the court calendar demanded her presence elsewhere. Gowns chosen for her by advisors who cared more about alliances than her comfort. Opinions softened and reshaped until they pleased everyone but her. She had given so much of herself to that court, believing it was the price of belonging. Standing outside the hall in the cold, she understood, for the first time, that belonging bought with pieces of yourself was never really belonging at all. She believed, in that moment, that she had lost everything that made her valuable. She did not yet know that everything she was about to lose had never been the thing that made her worth loving in the first place. If this story has already found its way into your heart, subscribe to Elf Stories, hit like, and let us know where in the world you are listening from. There is so much more still ahead of her. Roselyn left the Ashwood court before sunrise, taking nothing but a traveling cloak and a grief too large to name. She did not choose a destination. She simply walked until the silver trees gave way to plain wooden fences, until the language around her roughened into human dialects, until the ache in her chest was the only elven thing left about her. The road was long and unkind, and more than once she considered turning back, not out of hope that anything waited for her there, but because the unknown ahead of her felt, in its own way, more frightening than the humiliation behind her. She kept walking anyway, because there was nothing left in Ashwood worth returning for. She found herself 3 days later in a border town called Hollow Creek, a place too small to have heard of princes, too far from any court to care who she had once been engaged to. It was there, collapsed against the frozen well at the town's edge, half-starved and shaking from cold. Her body was never built to withstand. That a stranger found her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why an elf was dying in a human village in midwinter. He simply took off his own coat, wrapped it around her shoulders and said, "You can yell at me for touching you without asking once you're not blue." His name was Adrian, a blacksmith's son who had inherited the forge and none of his father's patience for small talk. He carried her to his cottage on the edge of town, built up the fire, and sat across from her in silence until her breathing steadied, offering nothing but presence, asking for nothing in return. Roselyn had spent her whole life being useful to be loved. Adrian was the first person who took care of her without expecting anything back at all. She should have left the moment she was strong enough to walk. Elves did not belong among humans, and humans did not trust elves who arrived with no explanation, and eyes still red from a grief they refused to speak of. The town's baker had crossed the street to avoid her the first week. and a group of children had once dared each other to touch her ear and run, as though she were a curiosity rather than a person. But Hollow Creek needed a healer, and Roselyn, whatever else had been taken from her, still had her mother's gift in her hands. The turn came on a night when the miller's youngest daughter fell into a fever no one in the village knew how to break. Roselyn worked through the night with herbs she had to explain, ingredient by ingredient, to a room full of suspicious adults who had never trusted an elf with anything more than distant politeness. By morning, the fever had broken, and the miller, a broad-weathered man who had barely spoken a civil word to her before, knelt at her feet in the frost and wept his gratitude. It was a small thing, but it was the first time in over a year that Roselyn had been thanked for something without being reminded, in the same breath, of what she was expected to give next. She stayed. 1 week became 1 season. 1 season became a life she had never asked for, and slowly, without her permission, began to want. Adrian gave her a room above the forge, and never once asked what she was running from. But one evening, mending a wound on his forearm from the day's work, Roselyn found herself telling him anyway. The wedding, the silence, the 3 words that ended her. She expected pity. She braced herself for it, the way she had braced for it from everyone at court. Adrian only looked at her for a long moment and said, "Then he's a fool. But I'm not sorry, because it means you're here." It was the first sentence anyone had spoken to her since the wedding that had not made her feel smaller. There were harder nights too, in those early months, nights when the townsfolk's suspicion outweighed their gratitude, when someone left a bundle of iron nails on her doorstep, an old and cruel warning meant for creatures the villagers still half believed she might be. Roselyn never mentioned it to Adrian. He found out anyway, the way he seemed to find out everything that mattered. And the next morning, he stood in the square long enough for every passerby to see him carrying her water bucket to her door himself, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. The nails did not appear again. There was, in those early months, a strangeness the town itself carried, one Roselyn noticed but could not yet name. Travelers passing through spoke of lights flickering along the far tree line at night, of livestock found spooked and shaking at dawn, with no tracks around them, of an unease that had crept into the borderlands over the past year that no one could quite explain. Roselyn told herself it was nothing to do with her. She had left the Ashwood court and its magic behind. She did not yet know how wrong she was. Roselyn went to bed that night with a question she could not silence. What if the life she had lost was never the one meant for her at all? What if being replaced had not ended her story? What if it had simply cleared the page for the one she was actually supposed to live? She did not yet dare to call it hope, but something in her, long buried under duty and heartbreak, had begun, quietly, dangerously, to wake up. If you're still with me, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where you're listening from tonight. The story is only just beginning. Spring came to Hollow Creek slowly, the way healing always does, in pieces too small to notice until, one day, Roselyn realized she had gone an entire week without thinking of the wedding at all. She and Adrian fell into a rhythm neither of them planned. Mornings, she tended the sick and the injured in the small room she had claimed as her own. Afternoons, she brought him tea at the forge, and stayed longer than the tea required. He taught her the names of human constellations, laughing at how offended she was that they were nowhere near as poetic as elven ones. The Weeping Maiden, she told him, was a far finer name than the old man's kettle, and he had laughed so hard, he nearly dropped the very kettle in question into the fire. She taught him, in turn, how to read the moods of the forest, which birds fell silent before a storm, which roots could ease a fever, which trees carried the faint hum of old magic that most humans walked past without ever noticing. It was, in its own quiet way, the first thing she had shared from her old world, that had not come with expectation attached. He never asked her to be anything other than what she was in each moment. Tired, she was allowed to be tired. Angry, she was allowed to be angry. For the first time in her life, Roselyn was not being measured against what she could provide. It frightened her more than she expected, because if she was not useful, not indispensable, not necessary, what exactly was left to be loved? Adrian answered that question without ever knowing it had been asked. One evening, when fever swept through Hollow Creek and Roselyn worked 3 days without rest to keep the town's children alive, she collapsed from exhaustion at his doorstep. She woke to find he had not left her side once, not to eat, not to sleep, not to tend his own forge. When she asked him why, bracing for an answer about how valuable a healer was to a small town, he only said, "Because it's you, Roselyn. Not what you can do, you." No one had ever separated the two for her before. There was a quieter moment too, that Roselyn returned to often in her memory. A night when a storm knocked out the forge's roof beam, and Adrian worked past midnight to repair it alone, rather than wake the town for help. She found him there, exhausted, hands raw from the work, and instead of tending his wounds the way the healer in her wanted to, she simply sat beside him on the cold floor and handed him water, letting him lean his head against her shoulder in silence. Neither of them spoke of what the moment meant. They didn't need to. It was, in its own unremarkable way, the first time Roselyn had let herself be still beside another person, without needing to fix, heal, or offer anything at all. Simply present, simply there, simply enough. Still, obstacles rose the way obstacles always do when something fragile begins to matter. Hollow Creek did not fully trust an elf among them. Whatever gratitude they carried for her healing hands and whispers followed her through the market square. An old woman named Marin, respected in the town for her long memory, warned Adrian openly one afternoon at the well. Roselyn overheard every word, though she was not meant to. Loving one of them is loving a river that will keep flowing long after your banks have dried up, boy. You'll grow old. She won't. Think carefully before you let a girl like that build a nest in your chest. Adrian's answer had been short and steady, and had reached Roselyn even from across the square. I'd rather have a short life that means something than a long one that doesn't. And in the back of Roselyn's mind, a colder fear had begun to take root. A fear she had not yet said aloud, even to herself. Elves who loved humans did not do so without cost. The old laws were clear about that, even if she had never expected to need to know them. Her own mother had once told her, half in warning, half in old rhyme, that a healer's blood carried debts that outlived her, debts that would one day be called in, whether she was ready or not. Roselyn had never understood the warning until now, standing in a life she had never expected to want this badly. She said nothing of this to Adrian. Not yet. Some fears are too large to hand to someone you are only beginning to trust with your heart. But on the night he finally took her hand, not out of comfort, not out of habit, but on purpose, deliberately, waiting for her to either pull away or hold on. Roselyn held on, and in that single quiet gesture, she felt something she had not felt since long before the wedding day. Chosen, not for her usefulness, not for her bloodline, simply chosen for being exactly who she was. She did not yet know that the kingdom she had fled was already beginning to fall apart without her, and that the truth behind her humiliation was far darker and far more desperate than a broken heart. If this story has you hoping for them, subscribe to Elf Stories. There are many more unforgettable tales waiting to be told. Before we continue, like this video and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It helps this story reach more hearts like yours. The seasons that followed were, in Roselyn's own quiet estimation, the gentlest of her long life. She and Adrian did not rush toward love. It arrived the way dawn arrives, imperceptibly, and then completely. A hand brushing hers while she stitched a wound, the two of them, on cold nights, standing shoulder to shoulder before the forge fire without needing to fill the silence with words. A laugh startled out of her, at something so small she couldn't later remember what it was, only that it was the first time she had laughed, truly laughed, since the wedding. He never once told her he loved her outright. Instead, he showed her in ways that mattered more. He learned which tease eased her homesickness, though she never named it as such. He carved her a small wooden box, shaped like the healing satchel she'd lost while fleeing the Ashwood court, filling it with dried herbs he'd asked traveling merchants to bring back for her, one at a time. Over months, without ever mentioning he was doing it, she found the box on her birthday, a day she had not told anyone. She still counted and understood, holding it, that he had been paying closer attention to her than anyone in her long life ever had. Roselyn began, slowly, to let herself imagine a future in Hollow Creek, a modest one, a human one. And that terrified her more than any battlefield ever could, because for an elf, choosing a mortal life was not simply a matter of the heart. It was then that the first true fracture appeared. A traveling merchant arrived in Hollow Creek carrying news from the Ashwood court, news that spread through the town before Roselyn even heard it firsthand. The barrier that protected the Elven Kingdom from the wildlands beyond it was weakening. Crops were failing along the border villages. Strange creatures, long kept out by old magic, had begun slipping through the cracks, and 2 outlying settlements had already been abandoned entirely. Roselyn told herself it was not her concern anymore. The kingdom had made its choice, publicly, cruelly, and she owed it nothing. But that night, for the first time since she'd arrived in Hollow Creek, she dreamed of her mother's voice, repeating an old lullaby about blood and binding that she hadn't thought of in years, and woke with her hands trembling, though she could not say why. She lit no candle. She simply sat in the dark, listening to her own heartbeat, and wondered why a kingdom that had discarded her still had the power to reach into her sleep. Adrian noticed. He always noticed. "Talk to me," he said, in the low, steady voice she'd come to rely on more than she liked to admit. She told him, finally, about the old elven laws, how a woman of her bloodline could not simply choose a mortal love without consequence, how doing so meant surrendering her immortality entirely, becoming as fragile and finite as the man in front of her. She told him she hadn't decided anything. She told him she was afraid. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing she had least expected. "I never asked you to become anything for me, Roselyn. I won't start now." It should have comforted her. Instead, it planted a new fear, that if she chose him, she would be giving up an eternity. And if she chose the kingdom that had humiliated her, she would be giving up him. There seemed to be no version of her future that did not require losing something irreplaceable. Days later, a second piece of unsettling news arrived, carried by the same merchant on his return journey. Elira, the woman Kaelin had chosen in Roselyn's place, had failed to perform the binding rite the barrier required. Whatever power the court had believed she possessed, it was not enough. The barrier was failing faster now, not slower, and the elders had grown desperate enough to send scouts beyond the court's borders. Scouts, the merchant said, who had been asking after a healer matching Roselyn's description in every border town they passed through. Roselyn sat with that information for a long time, turning it over, feeling something cold settle into her stomach. Because if Elira's power was not enough to hold the barrier, then why, in all the years before the wedding, had the elders never once asked Roselyn to try? She had never been given the chance to fail. She had simply been removed. That question would not leave her alone. It followed her through her days like a second shadow, sharpening into something close to dread. When, a week later, she noticed a stranger in gray traveling clothes, watching the forge from across the square. Gone by the time she looked twice, but unmistakably real. She did not tell Adrian. Not yet. She told herself she needed to understand what was happening before she frightened him with a fear she could not yet fully explain. The stranger in gray returned twice more that month, always at a distance, always gone before she could approach. On the third occasion, Roselyn finally crossed the square herself, determined to demand answers, only to find nothing but a folded scrap of parchment, tucked beneath a loose stone at the well's edge, bearing a single line of elven script she had not seen since childhood. The barrier remembers whose blood built it, even when the court forgets whose blood it owes. She read it a dozen times before she understood it was not a threat. It was a warning from someone inside the court who did not have the courage to say more. And though she did not yet know it, the answer waiting for her back in the Ashwood court was far more devastating than betrayal. If you've been holding your breath with her, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. The truth is closer than you think. The messenger arrived at Hollow Creek on a gray morning, wearing the silver colors of the Ashwood court, colors Roselyn had not seen in over a year and had hoped never to see again. He did not come to apologize. He came because the court was desperate, and desperation makes people finally tell the truth they should have told from the beginning. Roselyn received him alone, in the small healing room that had become her whole world, and listened as he unraveled a story that rewrote everything she thought she understood about the worst day of her life. The barrier protecting the Ashwood Kingdom had never simply required a binding rite performed by whoever stood beside the prince. It required a bloodline, a very specific, very rare bloodline capable of anchoring old magic strong enough to hold back what lay beyond it. Roselyn's bloodline, her mother's line, a gift so powerful and so costly to wield that generations before her had quietly agreed never to burden a single healer with it, unless the kingdom had no other choice left. The elders had always known Roselyn was the one true anchor the barrier needed. They had also learned, in the months before her wedding, of an old prophecy claiming that anchor would be permanently and irreversibly consumed by the rite, that the woman who performed it would lose herself entirely into the magic, becoming something closer to the barrier itself than to a living person ever again. Kaelin had been told, and rather than tell Roselyn the truth and let her choose her own fate, the elders, with Kaelin's quiet, cowardly agreement, decided it was kinder to remove her from consideration entirely, publicly, permanently, so thoroughly humiliated that she would never return to offer herself for a sacrifice they had no right to ask of her, but fully intended to eventually take anyway, once every other option failed. Illyra had never been chosen out of love. She had been chosen because she did not carry the bloodline, because choosing her bought Roselyn's freedom, even if freedom had to be disguised as cruelty to work. The messenger admitted quietly that Illyra herself had never been told the real reason behind Kaelin's sudden devotion, and had only recently begun to suspect she had been used as a shield in a plan that was never truly about her at all. Roselyn sat in stunned silence as the messenger finished. The betrayal she had carried for over a year, the humiliation that had defined her sense of worth ever since, had never been about her unworthiness at all. It had been, in its own broken and unforgivable way, an act meant to save her. It did not undo the pain. If anything, it deepened it into something more complicated. Grief for the years she had spent believing herself discarded, when she had actually been protected by people too cowardly to protect her honestly. She thought of every sleepless night she had spent replaying the wedding, every quiet cruelty she had absorbed from a court that watched her fall and did nothing, and understood that all of it had been allowed to happen deliberately, so that no one would ever look closely enough to ask what she was truly worth. "The barrier is failing faster now," the messenger said quietly. "Elira cannot hold it. Nothing human-made can hold it. The kingdom has perhaps a season left before the wildlands break through entirely. The elders sent me to ask if you would return, not command. Ask. They know now they have no right to command you anything." She thought, too, of the folded parchment still hidden in her healing satchel, the warning from someone inside the court who had known the truth long before this messenger arrived to finally speak it. "Who sent word to me before you did?" she asked. "Someone left me a message, elven script." They knew what the elders wouldn't say. The messenger's expression flickered. Recognition, quickly hidden. "I don't know," he said, too quickly to be believed. And Roselyn understood that even now, standing in the wreckage of their own dishonesty, someone in that court still preferred secrets to the truth. She let it go for now. There would be time enough later to learn who among them had risked everything to warn her when no one else would. Roselyn asked him one question before he left, her voice steadier than she felt. "And if I say no?" The messenger did not answer right away. "Then the court falls," he said finally, "and whatever comes through when the barrier breaks will not stop at Ashwood's borders. It never has, in the old stories. It simply keeps moving until something stronger stops it." Roselyn walked out to find Adrian at the forge, the weight of an entire kingdom's survival suddenly resting in her two hands, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at the mention of what the ritual would cost her. But he did not tell her what to choose. He only said when she finished, "Whatever you decide, I need you to decide it for you, not for them, not even for me." Roselyn realized, standing in the dying light of that forge, that for the first time in her entire life, the choice in front of her was actually, truly hers to make. That should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like the heaviest thing she had ever carried. If this revelation shook you the way it shook her, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. The hardest part of her story is still ahead. Roselyn did not sleep that night, nor the night after. She walked the frozen edges of Hollow Creek alone, turning the choice over and over until it wore smooth in her mind, though it never grew any lighter. An entire kingdom, flawed, cruel, capable of sacrificing her without her consent, stood on the edge of ruin, and only her blood could hold it together. A season of borrowed time, and then the wildlands would take everything. The border villages, the court, eventually perhaps even Hollow Creek itself, since no barrier had ever been drawn to protect a human town that had never needed one before the elven one began to fail. And on the other side of the choice stood Adrian, a mortal life, a finite, ordinary, unremarkable life, made extraordinary only by the fact that in it, she had finally been loved for exactly who she was, asked for nothing, expected to give nothing, needed for nothing but her presence. She thought of her mother, who had disappeared into duty until nothing personal remained of her. She thought of the girl she had been at the altar, believing her worth lived entirely in being chosen by someone else. She thought of the version of herself the ritual promised to create, an anchor, a vessel, something the old magic would use and eventually erase, leaving behind no wedding, no forge, no laughter over badly named constellations. Only silver light holding back the dark for people who had once thrown her away to protect their own comfort. On the third night, Adrian found her sitting at the edge of the frozen well where he had first found her dying, a lifetime ago now, though it had been barely more than a year. "I keep thinking," she said quietly without looking up, "that if I go, I save thousands of people who never did anything to deserve what's coming for them. And if I stay, I save myself. I don't know how to choose between those two things and still be able to live with whichever one I pick." Adrian sat beside her in the cold, the way he always did, without flinching from the hard thing in front of him. "Then don't choose between saving them and saving yourself," he said slowly. "Ask what you actually believe the ritual requires. You said the prophecy claims the anchor is consumed. Prophecies are old. Old things are sometimes wrong or incomplete, or twisted by people who wanted a particular outcome. Your mother's gift was healing, Roselyn, not disappearing. What if no one ever actually tested whether it had to cost you everything? Because no one who could have tested it was ever brave enough or loved enough to ask the question honestly. It was not an answer. It was something more valuable, a door Roselyn had not let herself see, because grief and duty had trained her, for her entire life, to expect that love always required losing herself completely. She returned to the Ashwood Court 3 days later, Adrian at her side, despite every elder's quiet disapproval of a mortal, standing where a mortal had never been permitted to stand. Whispers followed them through the silver halls, the same halls that had once watched her humiliation without a flicker of protest. This time, Roselyn did not flinch from the stairs. She walked through them, as though they no longer had any claim on her. She did not go to surrender herself to the old ritual as it had always been performed. She went to change it, working through nights with the court's oldest healers, humbled now, desperate now, finally willing to listen to the woman they had discarded. Roselyn discovered what Adrian's question had made her brave enough to look for. The original binding rite had never required the anchor to disappear into the magic alone. It required the anchor to be held, anchored, in turn, by a bond strong enough to keep her tethered to herself, even as the magic moved through her, a bond of choice, of love freely given, not duty extracted. No elven pairing had ever attempted the rite that way, because no elven pairing had ever needed to. Kaelin and Alira's arrangement had been duty from the start, and duty had nothing to hold on to when the old magic pulled. The eldest healer warned her that the record of such a bonded rite was ancient and incomplete, that no one now living had ever witnessed it performed, and that if the bond faltered even once during the ritual, the magic would take the path of least resistance and consume Roselyn anyway. Exactly as the old prophecy warned, there would be no second attempt, no slow retreat if it began to go wrong. Roselyn asked Adrian in front of the entire assembled court if he would stand as her anchor, not as a formality, not as a spectacle to replace the one that had humiliated her here once before, as a choice made freely by two people who had built something neither duty nor blood had ever given them. He said yes before she finished the question. It was Alira, of all people, who came to Roselyn the night before the ritual, pale, uncertain, standing in the doorway of the healing chambers with none of the poise the court had once admired in her. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "about any of it. I want you to believe that, even if you never forgive me for standing where you should have stood." Roselyn studied her for a long moment, surprised to find no anger left in her chest, only a tired kind of understanding. "We were both used," she said finally. "Neither of us chose this. It was not friendship, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of something neither cruelty nor duty could touch." And Roselyn later learned without surprise that it had been Alira who left the warning at the well, unable to speak the truth aloud, but unwilling to let Roselyn walk into the dark without it. The ritual, when it came, was unlike anything the Ashwood Court had witnessed in generations. Roselyn stood at the center of the old binding circle, as the silver light of the barrier's magic began to pour into her. And for one terrible moment, it seemed the warning had been right. The light surged too fast, too bright, pulling at something deep and essential inside her, and she felt the edges of herself beginning to blur, to scatter, to dissolve into the vastness of the old magic, exactly as the prophecy had promised. It was Adrian's hand, closing hard around hers, that stopped it. Not magic, not bloodline, simply the unwavering, stubborn fact of him, refusing to let go even as the light burned white-hot between their joined palms. "I'm right here," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of old power like the only steady thing left in the world. "You don't disappear, not on my watch." The magic, faced for the first time in its long history with a bond it could not simply burn through, slowed. Then it settled. It moved through Roselyn and into the tether she and Adrian held between them, tempered by something the ancient power had clearly been waiting centuries to find. Love that asked for nothing, given entirely by choice, strong enough to hold a person together instead of tearing them apart. The barrier held. Roselyn remained whole. She stood afterward in the same hall where she had once been abandoned at the altar, hands still laced with Adrian's, and watched Kaelin, pale, ashamed, finally understanding the cost of the lie he had let others tell for him. Unable to meet her eyes, she felt no need for revenge. The kingdom she had once needed to prove her worth to no longer had any power to define it. If her story has moved you this far, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Her ending is almost here. Roselyn returned to Hollow Creek, not because the court demanded it, but because it was by then unmistakably home. She kept her healer's hands and her long, unhurried elven years, but she also kept the forge, the badly named human constellations, and the man who had once wrapped a stranger in his coat without asking her name. The Ashwood court remembered her in the years that followed, not as the woman who had been replaced at her own wedding, but as the anchor who chose to be held rather than consumed, the first binding in 100 generations built on love instead of duty. Roselyn understood at last what her whole life had been trying to teach her the hard way. Being discarded had never meant she was without value. It had simply cleared a path toward the one place and the one person where her value was never in question at all. Some nights, standing at the door of the forge and watching Adrian work by firelight, she still thought of the girl in the white gown, frozen in the silence after 3 cruel words. She did not resent that girl anymore. Adrian grew old the way mortals do. Slowly, then all at once, silver creeping into his hair the way it had once crept only through Roselyn's old magic. She did not mourn the years ahead of time, the way she once feared she might. She lived them, fully, one by one, the way he had taught her to live everything, not for what it would become, but for exactly what it was while it lasted. Travelers who passed through Hollow Creek in later years sometimes asked the old blacksmith and his elven wife how their story had begun. Adrian always answered the same way, with the same half-smile he'd worn the night he wrapped a stranger in his coat and asked for nothing in return. She was replaced, he would say. Best thing that ever happened to her. And Roselyn, listening, no longer flinched at the word. She had learned at last that being replaced was never the end of her worth. It had only ever been the beginning of her finding it.